Oh, hey, man.
Hey.
What's up, bro? How's it going, dude?
Man, good to see you. Good to see you. How's everything?
Everything's great. I can't complain, honestly. The weather.
Okay, so there's a reason we started with that video, Father.
Okay, let's hear the apology. Come on.
Okay, so a few years back, I took my son to see Scott Hahn at a parish on Long Island. And at the beginning of the conference, I saw you standing outside and I got really excited to see you, but you were on the phone. So I didn't want to bother you. So I just like came up and I was like, hey, Father, how are you? I love all your talks. You've done so much for my faith. So we then go in to watch the conference. Scott Hahn gives this amazing presentation on fatherhood and St. Joseph. And I kind of had a feeling you guys were going to sneak out before the conference was like quite over. So I grabbed my son and I go, come on, I'll get you a picture with Paul Blart. So we sneak out and I'm coming out to get a picture with Paul Blart. And I think you thought I was coming to get a picture with you. And it led...
At the time, I didn't know Kevin was standing right behind me because you were looking right at me. And I'm like, oh, there's the guy who wants to talk. So there you go.
So it led to a bit of an awkward moment where I'm like, no, not you.
Just get us out of here.
Now, I heard that Kevin made that video kind of like from that situation. Is that actually true?
Yeah, I think so. I think that was probably the inspiration behind it.
That's amazing.
What was that like, even doing the conference with those guys? Like, did he have it at his house? Like, because we went and he had all the guys from King of Queens there. So I go to the same parish as Kevin. Nobody really bothers him because you don't want to, you're at mass and stuff. But he's super friendly, a really genuinely a nice guy. I've spoken to him once, but I really try not to bother him. But just even like, how did that whole thing come about?
Well, Kevin knew Scott. I had not met Scott yet. Kevin knew Scott. And so at a certain point, a mutual friend of ours talked to Kevin and said, hey, Bob, what about getting Father Ripperger and Scott Hahn together for some private conferences? And so I did a few private conferences for them. And then from that point on, I was a friend with Scott's. And then Kevin wanted to know if I wanted to go listen to him talk. And I said, yeah, sure, why not? So we went and went to the parish, watched him, and then when we were coming out, that's when you dissed me.
Yeah, I think I kind of respect that he doesn't like, he's not like the celebrity Catholic, because that is a danger. Like even you as a well-known priest, like are there dangers to being like the celebrity priest, or pitfalls that you have to watch out for?
Well, the main thing, I think that I think the biggest mistake people make is they've got this idea that I've been trying to build that celebrity status, and that's actually not the case. It's kind of funny because originally I didn't put any of the conferences or any of the homilies that I ever did online, and then my sister asked me, hey, would you be willing to, so I can listen to them? So then I created a private YouTube channel. And then I made the mistake of giving one of the conference links to this one woman, and then boom, it just blew up from there. And then people have this idea I'm all over the place, and actually probably about 80%, of the conferences that you hear are actually private. I don't do hardly anything public. I only do about 3 public conferences a year. But most of them are all private that I do for benefactors and things like that. And so and I record them, and then Steve Cunningham puts them up.
What year was like the first time they blew up on you?
Well, I think there was a lot of people listening to this stuff to begin with, but it was during COVID that people were just looking for stuff. And then that's when a number of people watching me really blew up. I think it's during COVID. So, as far as any of the dangers go, I just, I try not to focus on the fact that, a lot of people know me. I'm just trying to focus on doing the work that we were trying to do. But then also I figured at a certain point, well, if this platform has become what it is, then I'm going to use it to catechize people. And so that's why I maintain it. Otherwise, if I really thought that there were other people doing, a lot of, there are some people doing some good stuff, but I thought, if the bishops were actually doing their job and if the priests were doing their job, I wouldn't even bother.
Yeah, the first time I heard you was a talk called How to Raise a Man.
Mm.
And when I tell you that talk was life-changing, it was so eye-opening, and I was like, what the heck have they not been teaching me my whole life? But this was
Yeah.
way before COVID, but it was like a version of Catholicism I had never heard before. I had never been presented with anything traditional before that. And it kind of sent me down a rabbit hole to really just like changing my entire outlook on the faith. So thank you for everything that you have put out there. I don't know if we realize how many people are impacted by little things that we say or something we put out online, but it is a wonderful medium when it's used for that. It's just the pitfalls of the actual internet can be pretty harsh.
Yeah, it can be. I mean, it doesn't. I have my detractors, although but probably I get more entertainment from my detractors than I do anything else. So I had this one woman who was detracting against me, and she started referring to my conferences as Chad Blabs. So now I have on the entrance to my office, warning, entering the Chad Blabs labs. Right. So that's, and then another woman somebody said, you need to talk to Father Ripperger. This was on some forum. And he referred to me as that little dictator in a cassock. So that was so funny. I actually have a little plaque on my desk that says little dictator in a cassock. So I find that's actually more humorous than anything else. I think the thing I've started to notice is that the attacks are kind of increasing, but that's to be expected anytime you get kind of a high profile. But a lot of the traction now is by, I call them low information Catholics. It's people who don't really know their faith as well as they like to think they do. And so they're taking pot shots, but I don't pay too much attention to that. I only really pay attention to somebody if they've got a platform and he's got a platform, she's got a platform, and they're trying to inculcate in people false understanding of the church and its tradition and stuff like that. Then I'll say something, but otherwise I just let it go.
Okay, so I just read your latest book, Shop Talk. Before we get into that, we have a little bit of housekeeping we have to do. Rob and I just got our first sponsor. It's Recusant Cellars. They sent it. Look, this is a wine company that decided to sponsor us. And when we told them about some of the controversy we were facing, which some of the controversy is from people who are also detractors of you, we presented it to them and they said, we know exactly what you guys do. We fully support you. You guys can have at it. Do your thing. Don't worry. We're not worried about anything. So they are a Catholic family that sells wine. They're also a fruit farm from Washington. If you want to support Rob and I, this is an amazing way to do it. Recusant Cellars, they sent us 3 bottles of wine each. The first bottle, me and my wife drank like right away when it came. The second bottle my wife drank while I was away at a conference last weekend. So I had 1 bottle left. I said, we better get this promo in before I drink the 3rd bottle. All 3 of them I thoroughly enjoyed.
We were supposed to have them on
3
air.
bottles in this time frame, or are you talking about over the course of a few days?
Over the course of a week. Like they sent it last week, so it wasn't all tonight. I've only had half a glass tonight, and I only had it on air because I figured if I didn't drink it, I would forget to do it. But also, Enoch, you're the one who put this interview together, and we just spent the weekend together. So, I mean, I have to throw a thank you to you. But do you have any questions right off the bat from the book, Enoch?
No, you guys go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I kind of warned you that I was just going to hog the entire conversation here, but okay, so the book you wrote was Shop Talk, and as I read through it, I'm like, I had no idea like the blue collar beginnings of the origin story of Father Ripperger. Like it's kind of like a memoir where you go through your childhood and just talk about the different things from your childhood, growing up in a mechanic shop that your father owned, and how these little different scenarios like inspired your philosophical thought of the faith. And I thought it was amazing.
Yeah, it's this is obviously just a small portion of. I always tell people I had, I consider having had like this quasi-idyllic childhood because in the sense of everything that it provided for me formationally. It didn't mean we didn't have our difficulties and stuff like that, but it was just. There was so many things that I learned through the course of growing up with my father and my mother, for that matter. She's obviously she's only mentioned, I think, once or twice in here, but there was all sorts of stuff. And so I thought, a lot of the stuff that I learned under my father is the types of stuff that was conventional wisdom in the past. but it's not any conventional wisdom anymore. And so I thought, I'm going to just put the book together. There's a few stories I forgot to put in here, but that's okay. It's pretty much intact. It gives you a good sense of the timeline, what it was like working with my father.
It's interesting because I think most people would think that you were like a scholar from childhood just because of how thorough you are and how erudite you are. It's like,
well, I was one of those kids that was in all the advanced classes, the honors classes and all that type of thing. But I didn't really take my studies seriously until I got into college, and then started studying philosophy. And there was a couple of the professors who just, really drove home certain things. And then it was from there that I really started buckling down and studying. And then I just kind of continued it. Although I do consider myself to be one of those people that's going to spend time in purgatory for not having studied more than I should have. I should have studied a lot more than I did, but there it is.
I find that hard to believe, but I have to ask you this, when did you start discerning your vocation?
When I was 4, I was the youngest in the family. So when I was 4, all my siblings had gone to school. And so my mom just had me, and she thought, well, I'm going to go back to daily mass, because when she grew up, she did daily mass, and that was a real cornerstone to her spiritual life. So she started going back to mass. So when I was 4, back in that day, you didn't go to the communion rail unless you were actually receiving communion. So I'm sitting back in the pew, watching the priest give out communion at the communion rail, and I still have the image in my mind, seeing and thinking to myself, that's what I want to do. So from that time on, I thought I should be a priest. I mean, I did date, and then was miserable the whole time because of the fact that it was conflicting with this grace of a vocation. And so then out of high school, I went into the seminary, the New Rite Seminary initially, but it was so unorthodox. I said, I got to get a solid education. And so that's when I went to the University of San Francisco and studied under Father Fessio there. And then from there, went to get my degree in philosophy, my master's in philosophy, and then went back into the seminary and then got ordained for the fraternity eventually. And then they sent me on to get my PhD. So that's kind of the general way. And it's at a certain point, though, because I spent so much time in college, my parents were starting to wonder, when is this guy going to actually do some work for a change? But although as I mentioned in the book, in the summer times, I was working for my father and still doing that stuff. So
yeah, it wasn't that dissimilar of a childhood than I had. And what struck me the most is because, I mean, you're talking about a time period well before what the kids today are dealing with, right? There's no technology. Right. You're talking about riding your bike to and from the shop, and even the learning at the feet of your father, right? So I mean, I remember being a kid, and anytime my father had a project around the house, sitting and observing him and watching him, like becoming kind of like a jack of all trades. Like my father knew how to do everything. I'm talking, he would dig a cesspool in the back and run the washing machine just to the cesspool. We had 8 siblings, so we had to like chop the garage up into 4 different bedrooms to put all the kids in the different bedrooms and stuff. But I remember just watching at the feet of my father and really learning how to do almost all the skills I would need for life. And I don't know if kids today have that same experience.
No, I don't. Well, I think there's maybe a small handful that do, but I think generally they don't have that experience. And that's why I mentioned, you probably remember this in the book. I basically said, look, if a guy hasn't learned how to use a set of tools by the time he's in his early 20s, it's over. You're never going to get really, really good at it.
Yeah.
And so, and that's one of the things I was so thankful for growing up under my father, is getting that hands-on ability to actually learn mechanics. And then from there, I think I mentioned it also in the book, is that my brother and we started kind of branching out and learning more about electronics and all sorts of stuff. And so, now it's to the point where I've learned enough to where I've, basically finished the inside of my own cabins and stuff like that. So just, because part of it is too, is as a mechanic, you just can't, it's just brutal to pay someone for something that you already know how to do. Yeah. So now that I'm so busy, once in a while I have to do that. And I'm like, oof,
But okay, even the things you were talking about. Okay, so I always had a passion for figuring out how things worked, right? So like taking something apart, and then putting it back together. And then some of the stories you told, like even when your brother's giving you a wedgie, how you would you told him that he was sinning by doing that. I know it sounds like that's like two disconnected things, but it's not, because I had a, like, I was always kind of like that, where I wanted to take things apart, figure out how they work. But I also remember little things in my childhood making me like contemplate the things of the faith, like even like the philosophical underpinnings of right and wrong. And it's interesting, because I think most people think they have to come from like a particular background, but really coming from a blue collar mechanic, it still formed your mind to become like a deep thinker, you know?
Yeah, and I think that there's two parts to it. Is that, you know, it's one thing, like you said, to be able to take something apart and put it back together, but both being with my dad and my brother, and at least in the electronics side, but being under my dad specifically, is that he would teach me the conceptual stuff behind how this stuff worked. And so conceptually, but you know, by the time you're done, you've got your mind wrapped around how this stuff works conceptually. Well, that logical, that conceptual framework, and then my dad was extremely logical as an individual, and so learning the logic skills from him, and then or just learning how to think. I mean, obviously, I learned it when I went into to college and actually studied logic formally and things like that. But already the habits of thinking were already present, and so that made a huge difference in going forward. So that by the time I started studying philosophy and then theology, it was conceptually easy for me, actually, because of the fact that I had been in the habit of learning how conceptually how things actually work. So when I studied philosophy, for example, when I studied, the human faculties, as St. Thomas understood them, it was literally like a mechanics project. Start breaking it down into the various faculties, find out what they actually do. So you concept, and then you find, then like a mechanic, you know how things fit together, what how this part affects that part. And so then I was able to, be able to fit all of it together and get a clear understanding of, how psychologically we actually work. And the same thing is actually true in relationship to certain theological matters, that the churches, I think that especially today, because people are so eclectic in their theological thinking, they tend to be eclectic. They got these bits and pieces, but nobody seems to see how this all fits together. Like, for example, how the in relationship to going through the 3 stages of the interior life, well, how that actually relates to building of specific virtues in those stages, and then how that relates to prayer, and how it relates to how the gifts of the Holy Spirit function during those times. People just don't seem to have that. Whereas growing up, I was given that foundation, both through the mechanics, because as I mentioned in the book, mechanics is a very logical process. And so learning how that works was key to my formation intellectually for the rest of my life.
Yeah. How did you go about putting the series together on communism and the demonic spirits? Because like I couldn't believe how you put that all together, and it was so well done that even like an atheist, James Lindsay, was commenting on like how well it matched up. Like this is essentially what you were just describing, right? Like you're going through and putting these things together from the taking things apart and putting them back together.
Well, to be honest with you, I think it does actually go back to learning mechanics, because as a mechanic in a diagnosis, when you're trying to figure out what's wrong with a thing, what my father taught me to do is look for certain kinds of patterns. If there's this problem with the engine, you're going to get this kind of behavior out of the engine. If there's this kind of a thing, you're going to get. So you start to watch for patterns. And then from there, once you learn the patterns, then you can quickly go back to, okay, this is what the root of the problem is. And so that I took into even being the work that I do as an exorcist. But then as an exorcist, I was just watching the psychological patterns and behavior that the demons were doing, and reflecting on it. And that's one of the reasons I wrote this massive tome on it too. But just watching the patterns. And then I was, at the same time, because of my philosophy degree, I was always kind of studying communism, because we've, in this country, we're going through a rash of communistic, influence. I started just noticing it's the exact same kinds of patterns. If you strip the veneer of politics and diabolic influence from it, the patterns of thinking, the psychology is the same.
When does if you're coming into this formation and you're starting to put things together that clearly aren't taught anymore. Like, are you going crazy looking at some of this stuff and saying what, like, just watching how the Catholic faith is actually taught in current society versus what you're learning? Like, how did you handle that as you're figuring that stuff out?
Well, I'll admit I went through kind of phases where you just get really irritated by a lot of stuff, and even in the church, when there's just a basic lack of common sense in a lot of ways, not just in the way they talk and things like that. So, but at a certain point, I in the studies of St. John of the Cross that I did, and seeing how that kind of lines out with the Thomistic psychology, because John of the Cross openly says he's Thomistic in his foundation. I saw how all that stuff kind of interacted, and one of the things I really connected with was St. Thomas's discussion on the passions or emotions. And then he talks about how all the passions arise out of all the other emotions arise out of the emotion of love. And so basically the reason you have anger is because something that you love is being impacted or something like that. So, and what St. John of the Cross comes along later and says, this is just an attachment, right? So I started going back to, again, it's the mechanics thing. Okay, I'm seeing this is the effect I'm seeing. What's the actual cause in the machinery? So then I started looking at just realizing, well, if that's the case, then anytime I'm getting angry, it means that there's something I love, which is another name for an attachment. There's something I'm attached to. And so I have to start detaching from that. So even though I do, do a lot of preaching and stuff like that in regard to the state of the church and things like that, I just realized I have to be detached even from the state of the church, that in the end, the only thing that we can ultimately have an attachment to is God. Everything else, you have to be detached. You have to fight for it. It's like with our country. You have to fight your best for it, put everything you can in to make it the best country possible. Same with the church. But in the end, you have to be able to be completely detached from it. My dissertation director, actually, when I was writing my dissertation, he said, writing a dissertation is a funny thing because you have to pour yourself entirely into the thing. But you also have to be detached enough to be able to walk completely away from it. And that was a formulation of something that I'd actually had learned. And I think that there was some level of that detachment, even in relationship to my, just growing up into my father and my mom, is just learning, if you're going to do the right thing, a lot of times you just got to put aside how you feel and just do the right thing.
I got a question for Father, if you don't mind, Anthony.
Yeah, go ahead.
Father, you're a semi-contemplative.
Right.
I've seen you cut logs with a chainsaw for 6 hours straight without taking a break. Clearly, you're a man of fortitude. Did growing up at the shop, just early on, did it build some of that the habits of fortitude? And what kind of advice would you give anybody who's kind of more thoughtful, lazy, that wants to build fortitude moving forward?
Yeah, well, my sister one time said to one of my brother-in-laws, she says, "Hey, we grew up in a family that when you woke up, your feet hit the ground running," right? Because my parents were even though we were lower middle class, my parents were very excellence driven. You can be poor, but it doesn't mean that you can't strive for excellence. But in the context of and I think that kind of translated to working for my dad. First of all, just seeing how hard he worked all the time, and that he would only stop for just brief periods of time to kind of recoup, and then he would go right back into it, gave me a sense of, okay, this is what a real man does, right? You keep working and you don't stop. And so that I think the fortitude just came from the grind at the shop, because it's a grind. Mechanical work is a grind. And so I just realized, growing up, that doesn't matter if it's a grind, doesn't matter how you feel, there's still something else you got to get done. And so that sense of duty and obligation kept me moving and developing that virtue, I think.
Ryan Grant told me to ask you about holy duty, and I know you and Ryan are pretty close. So,
oh yeah, well, so when I was actually up in Coeur d'Alene where he lives, I decided to buy I had a truck, but it was a half-ton short bed, and I'm like, because my entire adult life I only owned a car for 3 years, and I'm 60, so all the other time I've always owned a pickup truck. And this pickup truck just wasn't doing it for me. So I decided to buy a 3/4 ton Dodge diesel. And when I bought it, there was just a little bit of, I managed to get it through a guy who had an auctioneer's license, and he got it for me at a really reasonable price. So, but it had a little bit of body damage. And so I took it to one of our parishioners and said, hey, can you just, fix the tailgate? Because that was what was about it. And so part of it was heavy duty was broken on the back of it. So this guy knew a guy that could actually find those characters to replace those. But he asked the guy, hey, can you just, instead of heavy duty, can you give me an O and an L? And then he just put holy duty on the back of it. So I had that truck until a year and a half ago when the drivetrain gave up the ghost. And I'm just like, A, I don't have time to fix it. And B, I don't want to drop $7,000 into it. So I went and bought a new one. But
what were some of your favorite cars to work on?
Probably my most favorite car that I ever did any work with one of the guys was, I did work on some Camaros that were pretty kind of interesting, but probably the most interesting car was, it was a 69 Javelin. Now, most people, it was a specific model that had a 390 it was a 300 horsepower engine in it. That guy would blow the doors off of guys who had 454s and everything. I mean, it was just a beast, this thing. And so that was probably the most favorite car that I ever remember having anything to really do with. And a lot of my friends in high school would ask me to, put new manifolds and carbs and cams and stuff like that and headers and that type of thing, which I would do for free. I wouldn't do that now for free, but then they were friends, so I did it for free. So, that was probably the most favorite car that I've ever worked on. I worked on some pretty odd cars because we worked on everything. Right, everything from small engines to light industrial, and as I mentioned in the book, we'd actually overhaul motors for people, but they had to bring the engines in. We wouldn't pull them because that was too time consuming. We just rebuild the motors and send them home with them. But we would get once in a while, we'd get some of these really, really old cars. Cars that I don't even think some of those I even see those hardly anymore. So it was the car stuff was actually pretty fun. Probably the thing I enjoyed the most though was the light industrial stuff, the Wisconsin engines that we would rebuild, the 4-cylinder engines that they would use on for water pumps or generators or on certain kind of platforms. And so that was kind of fun. There was a time when, because I had gotten pretty good at working on Wisconsin engines, a crane company had called us and they had one of these flatbeds where the back end also had a steering mechanism, but it was run by a Wisconsin engine. And they couldn't get it started. So I go out in fact, I mentioned it in the book Shop Talk. I go out to the place where this thing is sitting, and they're about to put one of these, 200 amp or whatever it is, or 200,000 volt transformers on this thing, but they have to be able to steer it, and they couldn't steer it because the engine wasn't running. And so I walk on to the site, and it's all this electrical stuff, and the guy just walks up to me, we count it in there, and he just says, hey, I just want to let you know there's 47,000 volts walking through. So, don't be waving anything metal around. And then he kind of stops and says, and don't do anything stupid, And so at that point, I'm like, I got you,
Yeah.
So I got, stuff like that. It was, sometimes going out in the field was actually enjoyable too.
I want to go back to the detachment from the situation in the church a little bit, because I kind of think we have in the church today, you have people who kind of fall dogmatically into their positions. And whether that's Francis is not the Pope, or Benedict didn't resign, or it's, Francis it's like all these different dogmatic positions, and they all seem to lean toward the trad camp. A lot of them do love the Latin Mass. Then, I kind of take the position where I don't know, and I don't really care, because it's not in my ability to change anything. Like, what can trads do to avoid falling into these dogmatic positions where they think anybody that attends this liturgy is, part of us? It's just kind of crazy in the trad world, and I don't know how to navigate it at times.
Well, there's certain theological questions that are extraordinarily complicated. So for me, it's analogous to an engine, right? If I open up the hood of a car and I just see wires and hoses and all sorts of stuff I don't even, parts that I don't even know what they actually work on, but I'm going to start making declarations like, hey, I think if we take this off, this will work. You're going to end up with something that doesn't run, right? Well, if you take that same analogy in relationship to theology, I notice a lot of the people that are weighing in, especially in the last 2 to 3 years, that are weighing in this stuff, they've never studied the authors and the historical authors in this area. And in order to do that, you have to know Latin. You have to be able to have a certain level of proficiency in philosophy and theology, because some of the distinctions are extraordinarily fine, but they're very clear. They're clear if you know the philosophy and you know the theology. But these people are just barging in and saying stuff, and it's becoming a mess. You know, I was just talking to some of the priests here yesterday. I said, I find it fascinating that you get these guys that are willing to wax quasi eloquently, or so they think, on some theological topic that literally could impact their salvation, and yet they're going to proceed on speculation.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just nutty to me. So when it comes to theology, there's certain areas I just avoid, even though I do know some of the basic arguments. I haven't spent the time to study that specific topic in depth throughout the course of the historical discussion of it. And by the way, a lot of these things were areas where theologians legitimately debated, right? And so people will just pick one thing and say, that's it, this is what it is. And it's just because it fits them emotionally, right? It's their attachment. They just don't want to, they just don't want to entertain the idea that the guy in white could say something ridiculous, right? They just don't want to entertain that. And so they just launch off into some conclusion that doesn't necessarily follow because of their emotional baggage. And so, and that's I think one of the real advantages of having grown up under my father is, I mentioned that in one of those, is that you have to put your emotions aside, how you feel, so that you can actually study this thing and know it properly. And in this case, it was to fix this thing, because what you think does not necessarily line out with the reality. And that's what I'm finding a lot with some of these people is that they're barging into areas and they don't even know the reality of what the tradition even was in the area. So that's the problem. And so, because I don't know it, I just kind of be detached from it. Part of it is my basic attitude is, I'm just going to live my Catholic life. I'm going to try and become holy and let God sort that other stuff out.
Yeah, I think, especially today, everybody thinks the church is and it is, don't get me wrong, the church is a mess, but there is an aspect of it where we're not being persecuted. Nobody's stopping you from becoming holy. Right. You have access to the sacraments. There's no government trying to, it's not like we have priests in foxholes or whatever, priest holes and things like that. So, I mean, when I see people take certain positions, especially like the sedevacantist position, and they're going into like the theories of this guy was a Freemason, and it's like, I don't know. I think it's a dangerous thing to put forth a proposition where the outcome could lead to, being separated from the church. Like I just wouldn't. I mean, look, I'm a construction worker, so I just would never feel okay putting that kind of weight behind something I said, where somebody would leave the church or go to some chapel because of something I said. It's a thing that scares me.
Yeah, that's true, because it's not that they're not only jeopardizing their own possible salvation, they're jeopardizing other people's, and they're going to be responsible for it.
Got a question for you, Father, if you don't mind. Looking back at the books that you've written, the Magisterium one, the books on evolution, the psychology book, the Deliverance Prayer. When it comes to shop talk, the other books, there's a direct, aim on who you're going towards and what you're talking about. Who did you have in mind when you wrote this book? And
that's a good question. Who is your target audience?
To be honest with you, my target audience was teenagers and guys under 25.
Okay, that's
these are some basic the lessons that I talk about in here. These are basic things that you're going to need to know if you're ever going to be a real man, but also if you're ever going to be able to think logically and actually function the way we were actually designed to function. So that was kind of my target, because as I kind of mentioned, I think in the beginning is the fact that there's so many of these young kids that just, and even Anthony had kind of mentioned, they have none of this. They have no exposure to it. And the two things that kind of come out here, which I actually talked about in that conference on how to raise a man, the two principal ways we mature is through pain and through responsibility. And that's kind of the story behind all this. My dad would put me in charge of stuff. He would tell me that I had to get it done, etc. If I didn't do it right, okay, go back and straighten it out. There was none of this, someone else is going to clean up my mess stuff. There was none of that. but then also just and just the grind of actually working. It's hard, and you bust your knuckles and stuff like that from time to time working, and that's just actually part of it. And you just, as long as it's just a mere flesh wound, you keep moving on, right? And so, but you don't see any of the kids have that because they're never put in responsible of anything, because they're allowed to play and do whatever they want until they're 18. Then they go to college and they're still irresponsible, and then they get out and they're still irresponsible, and they're playing video games until they're 35, so they're still irresponsible. But then the other thing is too, is they've never had to do anything that actually required them to build the fortitude, which is and actually the technical virtue is continence, where despite how you feel, or despite the fact that it's physically uncomfortable or painful, you still kept doing it. And so that was the kind of the real lesson in the book Shop Talk. Is for one of the real lessons for me is this is how real men function, basically.
All right, guys, we're only doing another 5 minutes on YouTube, and then we're going over to locals. So if you guys have questions, get them in super chat, because we're only going to go through super chats now. Okay, so Father Rob and I were scheduled to speak at a conference last weekend. There was some guy who went through some things I tweeted, and he found like me joking around with friends who call women broads. Like, it was just like silly stuff. Yeah. I'm like, oh, these broads, or there was a couple of conversations where, I'm talking to young men on this show, and we were talking about the people of the old covenant. So, we were trying to avoid YouTube censorship, so we called them Amish instead of Jewish. So this guy compiled all these things taken out of context and sent them to the conference and sent them to the bishop, and the bishop panicked and canceled us, right?
Yeah.
Now, what dawned on me was with the message that they're sending with something like that is that, look, there's a whole generation of young men, because you're talking about targeting young men under 25, right? There's this whole generation of young men who talk a little bit different than the generations before them. They've seen like the horrific damage feminism has wrought on the culture. They're kind of waking up to it. They're talking about Israel a little bit. And I'm not talking about the guys who go nuts and like blame them for everything. I'm just saying like there's this whole generation of guys who are just starting to think differently than the older generations who are kind of propagandized and stuff. And the message they sent by canceling us was like, there's no place for you guys in this church.
That's
like,
right.
No, we're canceling you. So that's our target audience. Also, we're trying to let young men see like a masculine version of Catholicism, where I feel like the church is completely failing these young guys at this point.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of interesting, because probably the reason that guy got you canceled is because he's woke, or because he's soft. He's soft as a man, and that's what you tend to see. In fact, I think I've even mentioned it to Fawaz in one of our threads, is the fact that the biggest critics of me, actually, are guys 25 to 35, unmarried, who have a masturbation and a porn problem.
Yeah.
And but what's happening is that these people, there's two problems with this group of people. They're low information. They don't understand how this stuff works, but at the same time, they've got this drive to act like they're morally superior and need to go around correcting this stuff. And so, and yet they don't have enough information or background to even really be entering into the discussions, not just about theological that I talk about, but even what it means to be a man, because they're not really men. Because if they're really men, I mean, most guys, when you grew up, men are just generally rougher characters, and so you just learn to grow, or you learn to realize that that doesn't mean anything. That doesn't necessarily, but this is just a guy being a guy, and so you just didn't pay that much attention to it. I grew up around some really rough characters growing up in Wyoming, and so when I see, like, people used to complain about Trump's tweets and that type of thing, and I'm like, just like, yeah, that's what I grew up under. That doesn't mean anything. I just want to know what the guy's going to do. Right. Yeah.
I'm on a construction site, right? Like the things I hear on a construction site are like, it's just
I actually worked in the oil field for just a little while to make some extra money, and they're just some of the most vulgar people around. But they're just like, well, this is what guys do if they're not, if they're not building virtue, basically. But you don't pay that much attention to it.
It's probably easier to being a man in Wyoming than California. I think it just comes.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, to give you an idea of what the types of guys I grew up with, just down the street from where we lived, there was this rancher who had a house there, but he actually had a ranch outside of Wyoming. And this is the types of guys I grew up. He was 250 pounds and not a single ounce of fat. This guy was like 6'5". He was gargantuan, and he was shoeing his horse. The horse kicked him. He got up, decked the horse, and broke its jaw. I mean, these are the types of guys I grew up around. So when you hear these guys who, that when they hear someone just criticize someone else and they're just like acting like women, I'm just like, I can't relate to that. That just doesn't fit my experience.
All right, Rob, let's do a couple of super chats because we are taking Father over to locals because I want to talk to Father. I just want to ask him a little bit about the immigration letter Francis sent today. I want to ask him a little bit about AI and what his thoughts are. And then I do want to just get a quick glance of what he thinks of Trump's first month. Like, I mean, these are things that I have to get to. So I hope Father's got a few more minutes than the hour he promised us.
Yeah,
so.
I should have a little bit more time.
A little bit more. I mean, I think
the only reason I'm cutting you short is because our house, the uptake motors on our furnaces are going out, so I got to get the numbers off and order them. But anyway,
okay, all right. So we're gonna do a couple of questions, and then we're gonna take Father over to locals, and we'll try and keep it as long as possible. I know he's having fun. I think he'll stay a little longer, guys. Don't worry. Father Ripperger, can you share your view? Oh, this is what I was going to ask. So, your view on UFOs and AGI. I recently got into Daniel O'Connor's content, and I'm reading his latest book with my mom. I mean, this is a big subject. I was going to ask you on the other side, but do you think that there's a possibility that AI, the alien thing, like they're talking about disclosure? Do you think there's any connection to the Antichrist with those topics, or do you think we just have to kind of take these things as they come and figure them out moment by moment?
Well, it's kind of funny because it's probably the same guy that got you canceled was trying to get us canceled in the location we're at. But I'm going to be giving a conference next month in Wisconsin on the very question of UFOs and all of that. And basically in there, I based some of it on a book called Alien Intrusion, which is, I think it's by Gary Bates is the guy's name. It's extraordinarily well done in parsing out a lot of the things. So in there, I'm basically going to show that there's actually a link between the promotion of UFOs and aliens and the evolutionary hypothesis. And so that's what the actual connection is, and that this is one of the things that we're starting to see kind of arise even more. But then also there's other real philosophical and theological issues that go along with that. And so so I preface it with that. One of the things I'll be talking about in this conference is the fact that exorcists come across demons who portray themselves in what they call themselves grays. And they literally manifest looking exactly like these aliens that you see out there. And they claim that they're not demons, they're not angels, they're not humans. So there's kind of this intermediate, non-moral, they're not good or bad kind of thing. And it's all a ruse. They're basically just demons doing that to get people to go down the rabbit holes. And there's been more than one exorcist that's actually had to deal with that. So does that have a connection to the Antichrist? Maybe. In the sense that the Antichrist is going to be endowed with Satan's intelligence. And so he's going to be perfectly possessed. So it's going to be Satan that's going to be operating through this guy. And so it'll be like an angelic intelligence, but it's the same thing. And in fact, if you look at abduction cases, for example, if you strip away the veneer of that it's an alien or a demon, it's actually the exact same patterns, which is the person loses bodily control. There is hyper focusing on the reproductive organs. There's all this stuff that actually goes, it's all pretty much the same kind of stuff. You see, there's also been numerous documented cases where people were being abducted by aliens, and they actually invoked Christ's name, and then boom, the demons disappeared, or the aliens disappeared. So it tells you something that's actually there. As far as the AI goes, is AI is like any other tool. It's extraordinarily powerful. It has the potential for doing an enormous amount of good, but I think they're going to use it for a lot of evil, and I think people are using it already for a lot of evil.
Look, these are topics that are entire shows, right? So, yeah. I mean, we could do 2 hours with you on aliens because, I mean, every generation before the before the Enlightenment had a place for non-human intelligences. It was the Enlightenment that brought this materials worldview that kind of said, no, there's no such thing as, it's just the material world. Now, all of a sudden, people are looking at aliens. We could do an entire show on that. We could do an entire show on AI. So we have to, evolution. I would talk to you about evolution all day because
Which, by the way, if you ever want to see probably the best discussion of evolution, it's called Foundations Restored.
Yes,
it's put out by the Colby Center. It is just dynamite. They go through every facet of it. It's just fantastic,
outstanding, and they have a video series 100%. Also. So definitely go and check that out if you guys haven't. Foundations Restored. That was kind of like the beginning of my journey to getting out of an evolutionary mindset, where just like throwing off some of the ridiculous notions that of the way modern Catholics think faith and science work together. So, all right, we'll do that topic another time because that's too much. But what other super chats we got, Rob? Okay, can't watch live, so question for later. What is one virtue that Father would recommend to the average trad Catholic male to practice during Lent? That's a good one.
Well, probably fortitude, just working on fortitude. And by that, I mean in the sense of taking on penances that actually require in embracing the cross and embracing the pain. One of the things that it occurred to me recently. So I knew a guy that decided he wanted to do the fast, Christ's fast. He wanted to go 40 days without eating. So he went to his doctor, and the doctor says, yeah, you can do it. The main thing you have to watch for is your electric lights. And he gave him what to do. He went 41 and a half days without eating. And so I'm thinking to myself, why is it that this guy really never fully developed the virtue of fasting in that? And the reason being is, and this is where I think that this is the lesson of this, the whole thing is because he still had an attachment to the food. He was thinking the whole time, man, when I get done with this, I'm just going to crush a steak and I'm going to eat this, I'm going to eat that.
I'm so guilty of that. Holy cow.
And it was actually in observing him, but this was important for me to realize is that we often don't grow, especially in relationship to things that are difficult, because of the fact that we're holding on to the attachment of the pleasure we're going to get out of it later, rather than just letting go of the whole thing, embracing the pain to get it sorted out, and be willing to walk away from it permanently if that's so what God would desire. And so I think that's the key thing that is why most people don't advance. But in relationship to fortitude, it really boils down to you have to be willing to put aside your comfort and your pleasure to engage what is painful and difficult. And so your goal has to be the virtue or the perfection I'm gaining in this, not the comfort you're going to get to enjoy later.
Man, that is such an amazing thing you just said, because every Easter or every Lent, I lose 25 pounds. When Easter comes, I cannot wait to engorge in the food and just, and by the time Pentecost comes, I gain the whole 25
It's like a 12-hour Muslim fast. That's what it is.
Well, yeah, and for me, because I do exorcism work, I basically fast 6 days a week when I'm during session weeks, and even outside. If I'm home, I'd still do that. If I'm traveling, it's a little more difficult. But I fast 6 days a week, which is basically only one meal a day, which is basically the old fast that they used to do in the early church. So I would follow that. So during Lent, I'll up it just a little bit, and then when I come out the other end, it's good to feast because Chesterton said you can't fast, you can't feast, you can't feast, you can't fast. But on the other hand, it's funny because once you have actually developed the virtue of fasting, when you feast, you enjoy it. But then when you come out the other end of it, you're like, okay, I'm ready to go back to fasting.
Yeah. Oh, man, that's such an interesting point. All right, we have any more super chats, Rob? Father is clearly a man's man. How does the church attract people like him to the priesthood in the current climate? And not just that, I'll add to that, a young man that is discerning, where does he go now? Because I will say, as a father with a son, like if my son has a vocation, where do you send him? Like, it's very scary.
Well, even the traditional religious orders a lot of times are just packed with guys who are effeminate. They're just, so if you get a man's man, they don't like the guy and they get rid of him. So that's one of the real difficulties. I think the way that we have to, it's funny. I can't remember. I think it's in this book actually, but if not, I failed to put it in. But my dad one time Maybe I didn't put it in. I was a subdeacon at the time, and I was just about to be ordained to the diaconate. And my dad and I are working. I'm on one bench and he's on the other. And just out of the blue, because I told you, in the book, he's a master of one-liners. And he would just say, you know what the problem is with the modern priesthood? And so I just looked up and said, no, what? He said, there's no more men left in it. That's what he said. And that's really true. And by men, we mean guys who are willing to sacrifice and suffer, not just offer the sacrifice of the mass in a traditional manner. They have to be willing to sacrifice, their comfort, what they want, all of those things. They have to be willing to die to those things. And most guys aren't. And they're too soft. And part of the difficulty is that most of the kids being raised today are so effeminate by the time they go into the seminary. It's an uphill climb for them to actually master any kind of masculinity after that, And so, I think I think we're in for it's going to be rough, I think, in the church for a little while, as far as the seminaries go, though. I would just tell the guys, pick a traditional order and just, and what the virtues are that you're going to need to develop. You work on those, and you work on it independently of what the other seminarians are doing, the culture in the seminary. You just focus on learning the faith, mastering your studies, and getting those virtues developed so that when you come out the other end, then you can be the type of priest. Now, there's one thing, and it goes back to this whole attachment issue. The one fundamental problem I see among all seminarians, and you see it even among priests who are compromising right and left, is they have too much of an attachment to their priesthood. So the seminarians are too attached to getting ordained. And then once they get ordained, they're too attached to their priesthood. And so they start compromising so they can continue functioning as a priest rather than being prudent and preaching what they need to preach, and etc. So
that came up with our conference this weekend, because it's like, okay, was the priest being prudent? I mean, it was literally one person complaining, right?
Yeah,
and it was one person complaining. It wasn't some big media storm. It wasn't going to get any attention. It was just one person complaining. And I'm not going to say the priest's name or anything. The guy seemed like a lovely man. He was at the conference. I didn't get a chance to talk to him. I was gonna talk to him if I did get a chance and just ask him, like, man, I understand the idea of fortitude and like picking your battles and stuff, but man, this was a nothing burger. Like, I mean, it's like, come on, man, put your foot down and just tell the guy that's emailing you, like, sir, we got your email. We don't care.
Well, yeah, it tells you how effeminate they are and how much they're wedded to human respect. But the other part of it is, and this is part of the dynamic in a couple of places that I've been canceled, is that what happens is the bishops are looking for an excuse to get you out of there. Yeah. So anybody who complains, they're going to do it. And this is one of the real problems actually in the priesthood today. The priests know that the minute someone complains, the bishop isn't going to do due diligence and find out what's going on. And then if it's true, back up if what the priest has said was actually true or was right or what have you, that they're going to back the priest up. Oh no, they'll just, the minute there's a complaint, they throw the priest under the bus, because the bishops by and large are effeminate. We're dealing with the fallout. There's a document, I don't know if you've ever read it. It was put out in 1960. It was sent to all the heads of the religious communities around the world by the Congregation for Religious out of the Vatican. It's called Institutio Religiosorum. There's a translation on the internet. You have got to read that document, because it basically says three things. One, stop ordaining the homosexuals.
Yeah.
Stop ordaining the pedophiles, and stop ordaining the men who aren't chaste. This is in 1960, which means there was a pre-existing problem with this. And now that turned out to be, by the time they got this thing out, it was a dead letter because they had already gotten in. And so now you have all these guys who are effeminate, they're unchaste, they've got these issues. And so when you go into the modern priesthood, you're dealing with a lot of guys who are just really effeminate. And so when you want to actually be manly, they just can't take it.
Rob, is there any other questions? Because I have to get Father to the other side.
We have three more that we got to get.
All right, let's go through them pretty quick.
This next one, Father, might be one you tell us you don't want to answer, but it's the biggest one, so we got to try.
Okay, question for Father. In 2025, can we conclude that Lefebvre was 1,000% right? Hindsight is 2010. And also St. Paul the No, come on, he's not answering this. Paul the Sixth ever helped Father in an exorcism?
No, he hasn't. But that doesn't mean anything. As far as Archbishop Lefebvre, I mean, obviously he saw the problem. I mean, I think it's a legitimate question to discuss. Did he proceed correctly? It's true also that the Vatican couldn't be trusted. They were playing shenanigans. They were waiting for him to die. There was all this stuff going on. So I get all that.
Right.
But I definitely think that he saw the problem. I don't know if you've heard this, but Benedict said that in the future, the one bishop that will be considered to be the most important in this time frame will be Lefebvre.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Benedict was heartbroken over that situation. I think he tried to reconcile it. It really did break his heart. I mean, you can see just by giving us the motu proprio to have the Latin Mass back and stuff. He really did want to heal that division there. So, all right, what else we got, Rob? Okay, evening, Father. Could you quickly go over when? Come on, guys. Are you kidding me? He gets a kid.
NFP is Licit.
What is NFP Licit? Getting married?
They know I'm going to tell them the straight dope. Okay. So, in Pius XII, in the Conference to Midwives, basically makes the observation that you have to have grave cause for its use. Pius XI also mentioned it, if I'm not mistaken. The church had before said it's a licit form of use if you have sufficiently grave cause. And there's been times people come to me and say, this is what we're dealing with. Can we use NFP? And they did have one of those four kinds of grave causes. I said, yeah, you can actually use it. But outside that context, the church said it was forbidden. You had to have grave cause. So there it is.
Yeah, we just had Conor Gallagher on. The guy's got 16 kids, and he said, "Look, me and my wife spoke about it. He's the owner of Tan, and he said, look, my wife and I talked about it, and it was like after every kid, we said, okay, is your physical health okay? Is your mental health okay? Like, there's no justified use to use NFP, and they had 16 kids. I mean, look, it's a hard topic. I know people don't like to talk about it, but look, the Catholic
go ahead.
No, I was going to say the Catholic teaching on birth control is what convinced me that the Catholic Church is the one true church. So, I mean, it's one of those things where it's like it's the only institution in the world that still proclaims that truth.
Yeah, to be quite frank with you, we wouldn't have virtually any discussion about when NFP is licit if one fundamental thing was in the minds of the Catholics, and that is that children are actually a good thing.
Yeah.
People don't believe that anymore. They think they're a burden. They think they're difficult. They can be burdensome and they can be difficult at times, but they're actually a good thing. In Scripture, there's this constant reference to them to be a blessing from God, and people today don't see it that way, and so that's why they're always looking for an out.
Yeah. Right. What do you got? One more, Rob? Or is that it? Okay. Does the fourth commandment bind on adults still under the parents' roof? If so, how strictly?
Okay. So so there's two different factors to this. For men who reach the age of majority, they're their own man. However, if they live under the roof of somebody, they have because the father is still the head of that household, he gets to set the parameters. Okay, you're in age of majority. You want to live here? These are the rules you have to live by because he's the head of the household. So it shifts from him being their head as the father to he's the head of the household. So if you're going to live in the household, you got to abide by his legitimate rules. Okay, daughters are a little bit different because daughters, if you actually look at question 154, the Secunda Secunda in the Summa, St. Thomas says that the primary reason that fornication is immoral is not because it's a sin against temperance. He said the primary reason that it's immoral is a sin against justice, against the father's right to protect the honor of his daughter.
Right.
Okay.
Wow.
That is the framework for understanding that according to the natural law, when a woman reaches the age of 18, she's still under the headship of her father. So she's still bound by the fourth commandment to obey him until she marries or until she enters under vows. And then the headship shifts to her husband and to this. And so basically the idea is that a woman was never to be without a head. And the reason for that was to protect her honor.
Yeah. Okay. I have to bring one more thing up because one of the other arguments I got into with the same person that sent the emails was mutual submission. And my point was, if mutual submission of the spouses is a legitimate thing, that would mean that the bishops are to submit to the laity. And I think that's kind of the thesis of what has happened since
Yeah.
the council. Like that's like a thesis of the problems is that the bishops submitted to the laity, and I think like mutual submission is it just kind of seems absurd to me to think that the husband and father is not the head of the home and the wife is subordinate to him.
Well, it's actually part of divine revelation. It's actually part of the natural law, but it's divine revelation that states that women are to submit to their husbands. Now, the difficulty lies in this. So there's a part in St. Paul in 1 Timothy where he talks about how there's to be they're to submit to one another.
Submit to one another.
But if you pay close attention to the context, he's talking about in relationship to the conjugal act. So that means, and he says, because the man's body is not his body, but the wife's, and the wife's body is not his. And so if there is a reasonable request to render the marital debt, they have a grave obligation. It's morally sinful not to submit it, not to render the marital debt. That's where the mutual submission is. But the entire tradition of the church until John Paul II, which I'll talk about here in a minute, said that the mutual submission stopped there, and that that in the governance of the household, the husband was the head of the household. So in the governance, it's the husband and the father. In relationship to the conjugal act, there's mutual submission. Outside that context, there is no mutual submission.
And it's absurd to think so.
Right.
Yeah, it is. I don't know if you've seen What a Woman Is, the final cut.
With Tim Gordon.
The final cut is just about done, which is drastically different than the long trailer. It's drastically better than long trailer. I think they got a couple of things they still got to clean up, but the rest of it is just, and we go into that in depth in there, that this is, and it's not part of it. The problem was John Paul II muddied the waters because he said, well, mutual submission doesn't pertain just to the conjugal act. Here's the problem. The problem is he said that during a Wednesday audience, which if you talk about the theological degrees of certitude or theological notes, it's at the bottom. The fact that this was part of divine revelation, the fact that this was taught completely in the entire history of the church, that the husband was the head of the household, that has infallible theological certitude. And what John Paul II said was, in the words of a good friend of mine who's extremely better known than I am, he said, at some future pope's going to have to correct that.
Yeah, there's going to be a bunch of muddied waters that I think are going to need to be clarified. I mean, I can talk to you on this topic all day too. So, all right, we're going over to the other side. Is there any other questions, Rob? Or
no, that's
all right, we're good. We're going to the other side. I have to ask Father about a couple of things, especially about the letter Francis sent over today. Just because I have to address, I think, what the biggest issue with what Francis said is, and it's not like it's heretical or anything like that. It's just problematic in that. All right, let's go over to the other side. We'll do it over there.
Don't forget the book, guys. Shop Talk.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Book, yeah.
Shop Talk with
the link is in the description.
This was an awesome book, especially because it brought back memories of my child. Like I know his target audience was 25 and under, but if you're a millennial or Gen X especially, you are going to be brought back to your childhood. Like we did. I think he aimed it at those younger guys because that's something they're lacking. But what it'll do for you if you're Gen X or millennial is kind of bring you back to your childhood a little bit. It was really an amazing book. I thank you so much for sending it to us, Father, and thank you for this interview.
Oh, you're welcome.
So, yeah, guys, go buy that book. We're going to go over to the other side. I have to ask Father about a couple of things over there. I hope he sticks with us for a few minutes more.
I can give you 10 minutes.
All right, we'll push him.
And then I got to get to my furnace.
Yeah, he's going to freeze to death for the rest of the day.
All right, we're going over to the other side.
If that motor craps out, we're in trouble.
It's over.
All right. Join us.